you didn't hear that, we are in progress. So I want to give you all the opportunity, especially in light of, Holy Week, which we're right in the middle of. Any thoughts while you're reading this book? I mean, there are a lot that come to my mind, but I sometimes feel like I don't give you all the opportunity to really add your own 2 cents worth. And what kind of thoughts or feelings or questions do you have as you continue to read? Just to let you know where we are, we're going to be looking at chapter 9, 10, and possibly 11 today. It's all a matter of how far we get. And then we'll certainly begin next week, beginning with chapter 12, which is, you should probably have read through chapter 12 by next week. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts? Just jump right in.
I'm finding it a little bit hard to read.
Really?
Partly because he so personalizes so much that he's often off the topic.
Yeah.
And I've had a hard time focusing on his ideas and the structure of it. You have to keep reminding yourself of the organization of the book, and it's hard to do that. It's not natural to do that when you set the book down and go do something else and come back and read. But
Right.
So it's been a hard one for me to get into. But now that I'm about halfway through, I'm beginning to think this is a good book.
Yeah. Well, there are some things, and I think you're right about Spong writing from a very personal perspective. Sometimes when he makes his point about people reading the Bible literally, it's almost coming from a place, it seems to me, a place of anger, or severe frustration. And I certainly share that. I know what he's talking about.
Too. Yeah, right. But,
I'm sorry, Dwight?
yes, I feel that way too. That it is. I agree with him. In the misreading of the Bible and everything. So that's not what alienates me or makes it difficult for me.
Yeah. There is one little bone that he has to pick, that he says he's not going to pick it, but he continues to bring it up, and that is his opinion about a hypothesis that when Matthew and Luke were writing their Gospels, this would have been around 85 to 90 of the Common Era, they had a document that has never been found that is called Q. Q, which stands for source, this source, which was hypothesized to be a list of Jesus' sayings. And what, in case you get to the point where he mentions Q again, what Spong wants to rely on, I think, is, first of all, he says it's hard to make a case when you don't have a document to support it. It is equally as plausible, he says, that when Luke wrote his gospel, instead of, Matthew and Luke both using Mark in one hand and then Q in another hand, what Spong proposes is that Matthew, when writing his gospel in 85, used Mark, which was written in 70, and then also wrote the material that has been attributed to Q. But then when Luke wrote his gospel, he had Matthew in front of him. And so it seems like a minor point, but he does seem to have another book that he wants to write. It's kind of a point that's kind of I think, eating away at him on this. But I'm grateful for him, because that's utterly plausible. And I think I've mentioned in the past, one of my friends, David Dungan, who held to the same theory. Actually, he believed that Matthew was written before Mark. So the received hypothesis, the two source hypothesis, is not wholly agreed upon. And, and biblical scholars continue to debate this kind of thing. Any other comments? Well, last time we were looking at the introduction of Joseph into the birth story. And remember Spong's thesis that the Gospel of Matthew was written as a collection, really a collection of sermons that were preached, you might say, in the synagogue worship service that was attended by people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. I don't call them Christians because the word Christian is going to be a term that is going to be used mostly in the Gentile area that Paul, in present-day Turkey, where Paul went and was on his missionary journeys. But the people in these synagogues who believed Jesus was the Messiah were good Jews. They were trying to be good Jews, and they were trying to understand how it is that they could claim that this man who died on the cross and did not fulfill a lot of the roles that the Messiah was expected to fulfill, become a king like David or a great warrior, how it is that this Jesus could be the Messiah. And Spong tries to establish this thesis that this was all taking place in the context, the liturgical context of the synagogue. Now, one of the criticisms that I have of this, apart from the fact that he's assuming that the new year begins on Passover instead of where it usually begins on Rosh Hashanah, and then thus the liturgical readings would begin at that time. What he doesn't mention in this, we're already through 5 or 6 readings each Sabbath. In the synagogue, there would be a reading from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Well, there'd be several of them, one from the Torah, one from the prophets, one from the Psalms. But what Spong is not saying is what liturgically would have been going on in this good Jewish synagogue, apart from the fact that it was filled with many followers of Jesus. I want to know what the liturgical readings were for that day. Now, he gives us references to texts, especially Isaiah, when trying to understand who Jesus is, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 42. But he's frustratingly silent on how it is that this sermon is matching up with the regular synagogue worship. I want a little more information on that. It may be, I don't know what he presumes, and I'm going to ask Mac to jump in on this because you've read the whole book, Mac. But it may be that the synagogue worship service is, I can't imagine them not reading the Hebrew Bible, but maybe it's a new type of group of people getting together and trying to understand Jesus by reading the Hebrew Bible, not in the liturgical way that other synagogues would. I find this frustrating because I want him to tell me what's going on. Mac, have you thought about that idea much? I ask you because you've read the book.
Yeah, no, I really haven't. I mean, I think you make a valid point. The one point that I would make is that I don't get hung up about where he starts, because once he starts, and I don't care if he starts, it's a cycle. Yeah. It's a 12-month cycle. And once he starts somewhere, then he becomes chronological. And it's only logical, to end it with where, the Passover really is the story. So, and I think he does a fairly good job of saying, okay, now what story are we going to find in the New Testament? Well, what happens next in the sequence of the Jewish holidays? And I think he does a pretty good job of saying, well, any Jew would know what's coming next, what kind of a story is coming next.
And this is
and what this story means. That's I think the biggest insight is, and maybe it's an assumption, that a Jewish reader would just instantly know to what is being referred. And, I say, that could well be true, but.
Yeah. And he does a very, and remember, we have to keep in mind, and I will try, because we're not really well versed in the Jewish holidays, but we're starting with Passover, and we're in this 7-week period between Passover and a Jewish holiday called Shavuot. Passover commemorates it is the Feast of Freedom, commemorating the escape from Egypt, as we read in Exodus. And then Shavuot, which comes about 50 days later, it's why it's called Pentecost in the Greek word, is a commemoration of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. So following that liturgical cycle, there's a 50-day period of time in which the Israelites are wandering through the desert and they come to Mount Sinai. And this is when the law is going to be given. And the readings that we've been doing and the readings of Matthew, the genealogy, the introduction of Joseph into the narrative, the gifts of the Magi and the baptism of Jesus, all of these things are being introduced into the liturgy of the synagogue in this interim period between Passover and Shavuot. The Feast of Freedom from escape from Egypt, 50 days later, the giving of the law, which is the pivotal point in Jewish identity on Mount Sinai. And so that is assumed, that is assumed in the Jewish mentality, the way that I can't think of a good example, but we as Americans we know what happens on the 4th of July. It's just part of who we are, right? So Spong is trying to make that point very clearly. We talked last time about Joseph and how he most likely was not a historical figure, but his introduction into the book of Matthew makes an important point that is relevant to the Messiah. And I just want to read this. This is where we ended last time. One of the Messiah's roles in Jewish history was to bring the children of Israel back together into a single nation. They had been divided 700 years prior to Jesus between two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. How better could Matthew symbolize that than to suggest that even though the Messiah was a member of the tribe of Judah, the line of David, he had been protected and legitimized by a man named Joseph. Joseph is the progenitor of the nation of Israel. And thus the two Jewish patriarchs are united in Jesus. Joseph was a literary character created by Matthew to symbolize the messianic task of binding the Jewish nation into one united people by bringing together the divided tribes of the Hebrew people and the birth of Jesus. And this, says Spong, is what Jews listening to the story of Jesus would have heard. They would have known the symbolism. They would not have been reading this literally, which brings us then to the second chapter of Matthew. And this is where the story of the birth of Jesus, after Joseph himself is told in a dream that the Messiah would be born of the Virgin Mary. And now the birth takes place. And here's a place where Spong is going to say, look, in Isaiah, and Isaiah is broken up into 3 different sections, and this would have been the most recently written section of Isaiah, written during the time when the Jews had returned from Babylon and were trying to rebuild their temple in Israel. And they had high messianic hopes. They had high hopes that their nation, that had experienced another form of freedom, another escape from slavery, so to speak, would once again provide a Messiah that would unite not just the people of Israel, but unite the world. So when we read the story of the Magi, we have to keep in mind, according to Spong, this section of Isaiah 60, verses 1 through 3, and then I've added verse 6 onto this as well. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Herds of camel will cover your land, young camels of Midian and Ephah, and all from Sheba will come, bearing gold and incense, and proclaiming the praise of the Lord. So look at some of the imagery here. First of all, something arising and shining in the midst of darkness, right? This was an image that was present in the mind of the Jews. The Lord rises upon you and his glory appears to you. Nations come to your light. Now in Greek, this word is ethnos, is where it's attributed to, or I mean, it's translated as Gentiles. When you see nations, here Gentiles. Gentiles will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. This was an image we find even earlier in Isaiah, that Jerusalem would be the city on the hill to which all the nations would flock and glory in the presence of God and in the covenant. So this image is what, according to Spong, the author of Matthew wants people to keep in mind as they listen to the story of the Magi. And I thought, I know I have a Bible around here someplace. Sorry, I thought I would read this just so we remember what the story is about. It's in Matthew chapter 2. And I should have marked this prior to coming here. The time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." And then, of course, the story moves on from there. We know the so-called wise men, the Magi, go to Bethlehem and find Jesus, bringing their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Spong wants to make sure that we're all aware that this idea, we're not reading history here. And every Christmas, there's usually some sort of, astrophysicist who tries to make some sort of argument as to what was the star that actually appeared in the sky. Could it have been a comet? Was Jesus born under, one of the many comets that passed through or near Earth on their various cycles? Was it Halley's comet or other, or was it a special, astrophysical event that happened in the sky? And Spong makes the point, almost sarcastically, that if a star was going to appear, we know stars are often millions of light years away, that this event would have had to happen actually 1 million or so years prior to the appearance of the star. He really tries to undermine this whole idea that there was a star in the first place. The star is not meant to be read literally. And he says very clearly on page 91, there was no star. Let me read that for you here. That is not how the world operates. So we're driven by rationality out of our biblical literalism to entertain other conclusions. There never was a star in the east. That is a fact. Now those are fighting words, actually, for a lot of people. That is a fact, right? All of those planetarium programs designed to give astronomical content to this story show just how seductive literal interpretations of the Bible can be. There were also no wise men. This bursts a lot of bubbles for people. But what Spong wants to say is that Jews hearing this story would have known the symbolic significance of what happens and what the awaited Messiah would bring, and who that awaited Messiah was going to be, what type of person. Now, there's one thing that I find interesting about this, and that Spong really doesn't develop it as much, but the idea of the gifts that are brought. If you go back to Isaiah 60, you will see that the kings will come, and well, actually it doesn't really say that the kings are coming bearing the gifts. All from Sheba will come bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord. So it's, it's not even an accurate reading of Isaiah 60, but this idea of kings coming, but bearing a gift that's not present in Isaiah. They've got gold and incense. And of course, the most pleasant incense of this time used in the temple would have been frankincense. So it does get translated into gold, frankincense, and then myrrh. This addition of myrrh as, somewhat a divergence from the Isaiah 60 passage raises some interesting questions. And this is where theologians have, tried to read symbolically into what's happening, not literally, but the Magi who are coming, the Magi represent the nations of the world. And that's that messianic hope that the nations of the world will recognize who this Messiah is, and that the nations of the world will receive the same type of deliverance from bondage as that which is hoped for by the Jews. And that they must consult, even Herod himself, the king of the Jews, must consult the Jewish scriptures in order to find out who this Messiah is and where the Messiah will be born. So it is what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, which is the lens through which we can come to understand who this Messiah is. But this introduction of myrrh is really interesting, because there is a theological interpretation that comes later that Jesus as a Messiah has really a threefold mission and a threefold vocation. He is priest, prophet, and king. And these gifts represent those three aspects of his vocation as Messiah. The gold represents his kingly function. This was the kind of Messiah that many people were expecting in Jerusalem at the time that this event would have happened, or 85 of the Common Era, that the Messiah would be a king, the king of the Jews, a different kind of king, nevertheless, but a king worthy of the most valuable of metals, but also a priest. A priest is one who is a mediator between the people and God. And that which is associated with the priest is what was in the temple all the time, and that was burning incense, frankincense to God. This idea of burnt offerings was common in the ancient Near East, and even prior to that around the world. The idea that the gods, being spiritual beings, are fed by the smells, by the smoke and the smells of that which is being burned on the altar. And so frankincense is constantly a presence in the temple. So now we have the presence of the king, and we have the presence of a priest, a mediator, and then finally it has to be filled out with another function that Jesus fulfills, and that of the prophet. And who were the prophets but those, especially if we read Jeremiah, those who were reviled by the people themselves, those who were often scorned and sometimes killed. And this is where myrrh comes into. This is the introduction of myrrh into the equation. Myrrh is the embalming spice that's used. you might remember the story of the woman who brings the alabaster jar of nard. Nard is a myrrh derivative used for anointing bodies at death. And so this threefold nature of the vocation of Jesus, the call of this Messiah, is represented in this story so well. But Spong wants to make clear, look, let's read it the way Jewish followers of Jesus would have been reading it. The star that shines is not an actual star. The star that shines is the light of the Messiah coming into the world that is covering the earth. Thick darkness is over the people. The Messiah rises like a star to shine upon that darkness, and his glory appears over you, so much so that not just Jews, but the nations of the world come to his glory. This is what's happening in the story of the Magi, and Spong wants to make clear that we do not read it literally. So I'll give you an opportunity to say a few things here, but let me just conclude with his comment. Our brief study of Isaiah 60 changes how we look at the symbols Matthew built into his birth story. Over the centuries, we've conflated Matthew's story with the source of his story in Isaiah. Matthew wants to emphasize that Jesus was to be king of the universe, making gold an appropriate gift. He was to be the life in whom God was experienced, to be present, making frankincense an appropriate gift. And he was to accomplish his purpose through his death on the cross, making myrrh an appropriate gift. So any comments about that? There's the symbolic nature of that, the symbolic reading of that text. Any comments? Questions?
Very well said. That's very well, pretty convincing to me.
Yes, that's a beautiful thing about Spong, is he's convincing on every page, or so it seems, you know. Well, let's move on, because the idea of what a Messiah was going to be like is always going to be, even before Jesus, was always going to be interpreted through the lens of who the great deliverer of the Israelites was, and that was Moses. So if you are going, you know, we've gone to great lengths here in the first chapter of Matthew to show that Jesus is of the line of David, that he brings the two nations of Israel together. But not only that, he is a deliverer for all the nations. And we're starting to get intimations of this by the Magi coming to offer their gifts. But if you really want to flesh out his messiahship, you have to compare him to the deliverer par excellence, Moses, the reputed writer of the Torah, the one whom God chose in Exodus during the reign of Pharaoh, when the Israelites were being held captive, or excuse me, the Israelites were enslaved, building, structures, making bricks without straw, all of those things that reflect their oppression. And it would be Moses who would redeem them from this. And so if Jesus was worth his salt as a Messiah, he must at least be as good as Moses, if not better. Must at least be as good as Moses, if not better. And this is the task that that the author of Matthew wants to try to accomplish in the telling of a couple of stories that follow. The story of the so-called slaughter of the innocents, the story of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, and the story of Jesus going into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. We can look at those three stories: the slaughter of the innocents, the baptism of Jesus, and the what was the third one? I just said I'm losing, and the temptation in the wilderness. have direct parallels to the story of Moses. So people sitting in the synagogues would have heard this and said, ah, yeah, makes a lot of sense here, right? So let's read Matthew 2, verses 16 through 18. I think I've read some of this. And this is the portion of the scripture that follows the gifts, the coming of the Magi. And of course, you know that Herod gets upset, the Magi don't return to him, and Herod says, this king of the Jews is a threat to me, and I don't know where to find him, but I know he was in Bethlehem. So I'm going to send out my armies to try to find this child. And just to make sure I get him, I'm going to kill every male child in the village. If you know the story of Exodus, if you watch the 10 Commandments every Holy Week, this will certainly be a familiar story. So let me just read on here. Now, after they had left, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Ding, ding, ding. There's your first marker, right? Egypt, right? Flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. And this would be Joel, out of Egypt, I have called my son. No, Hosea, excuse me. So again, Joseph serving as the protector of the child, as you would expect Joseph to be, Joseph, the symbolic Joseph. And then the massacre of the innocents. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. This is pretty clear as to what Matthew is trying to do. You might remember the story of Moses, right? And the parallels with Herod. Moses was born at a time in Egypt. I mean, historically, if we could pinpoint this time, it would have been around 1250 BCE, under the Pharaoh Ramses II. That's where we believe the story told in Exodus best matches up with the historical circumstances that we know from archaeology. So 1250 years prior to Jesus. The story goes that Pharaoh, looking out and seeing the increase of the Hebrew children, gets afraid. He says, my gosh, what's going to happen if we allow these Hebrews to, just continue to propagate the way they're going to overrun us? And by the way, that was a common fear that we saw in the South shortly after the Civil War too. We got to do something. The sexual productivity or the biological productivity of African Americans or freed slaves at that time became a real threat. They were already in huge numbers. Now, what's going to happen if they start reproducing? We better, put a stop to this. So this is one of the means of oppression throughout history, has been the if you want to call it the, I can't think of the right word now. Trying to eliminate the sexual productivity of those who are your underlings, and so this is how Pharaoh does it. However, now the funny thing about this is that Pharaoh's not a very bright guy, because if you really want to eliminate sexual productivity, you don't kill the males, right? All it takes is one male and a lot of females to, continue the line. So, there's got to be some tongue in cheek over this. Look how stupid Pharaoh is. He's going to kill all the male children. Well, this anybody who's had flocks of goats knows, or cattle knows that that's, just poor, as John Harrington once pointed out, that's just poor agricultural economics, or his exact words. But anyway, so he kills all the male children. And of course, the mother of Moses, loving her child, places him in a basket and puts him in the Nile River, where he's later found by the daughter of Pharaoh. And then, of course, Moses' sister Miriam is following along and is able to find a wet nurse, because naturally Pharaoh's daughter found a nice little puppy and wants to take it home and raise it as her own. So, what we said about this, you have to feed him every day. I already have a wet nurse and everything, So that's how the story, that's how the story goes. And, this wonderful, miraculous event that the mother of Moses, in the midst of this chaos, is able to continue to be the true mother, the wet nurse of Moses himself. Moses grows up to become, a member of the household of Pharaoh, and then one day kills an Egyptian soldier who's oppressing a Hebrew slave, and then becomes an outlaw, goes on. And this is when he goes into the desert, and God says, go back to my people and bring them into the desert to worship me. Moses does so, but Pharaoh won't let the people go until finally great events take place. This great plague that happens, and all of the, it's kind of tit for tat, a quid pro quo. All of the firstborn male children of the Egyptians are killed by the angel of death. But all of this, when you're hearing the story in Matthew, people would have been hearing, oh, this is the Pharaoh story again. And Jesus, just like Moses, had to be miraculously whisked away to a place and saved through unlikely events, all the while there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. This image here I thought was really interesting. It's a image painted by Paul Rubens, but you see Mary here in her traditional blue holding the child Jesus, when all around here are those children who were sacrificed, as a result of Herod's jealousy. But Spong wants to say this never happened. Most likely, had it happened, even in the Roman era, Herod would have had to answer for it, right? You just don't go out and kill a bunch of children, right? The historicity is not the point. What the point is that the author of Matthew is trying to draw a clear connection between the miraculous events that happened in Exodus and the deliverer, that gave rise to a deliverer named Moses, are very similar to the miraculous events surrounding the person of Jesus. To put it in no uncertain terms, Jesus is Moses 2.0, to use the most recent, digital terminology. Jesus is Moses 2.0, a new, improved version of Moses. And make no doubt about it, he is like Moses in every way, but even better. He is the person we are expecting as Messiah. So comments about this?
Yeah, Dan, I have one, and I can't remember if he gets into this or not, if Spong gets into this or not, but there's really more depth to that Passover story.
Correct.
First of all, I mean, just like just like some of the other things, that didn't happen. I mean, there was no slaughter of the innocents. And the main reason that we know that is because even though Jewish histories were kind of primitive, as you pointed out, I think earlier, something like that in Egyptian history, they would have written it down.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't happen. And by the same token, the one didn't happen in Bethlehem either,
Right.
because
Right.
it would have been remarked upon. It would have been a horrible catastrophe that just couldn't escape. And there's no reference to those kind of events anywhere else.
Yeah, Josephus, for example, would have written.
Yeah,
Written about
just so it's inconceivable that they would have actually happened. But the story in the Old Testament that I can't remember if Spong develops is that story where God kills the firstborn. You
Right.
have the whole aspect of the Jews with the blood of the Paschal lamb marked on the lintel of their doorposts, and that's why God passes over them, and their kids are spared.
Right.
And so that whole idea of the blood and the lamb, I mean, that has a lot of implications for the New Testament down the road.
Oh, absolutely. And, and as we are in Holy Week, it's really important for Christian theology to make that connection. The blood on the doorposts and the lintel of the house of the Israelites, where God's angel of death passes over them, that is analogous to is analogous to the blood of Jesus that is painted on the lintels and doorposts of our soul or our heart through our baptism, redeeming us from the sting of death. So it's our baptism, we put on Christ so that death is no longer a threat. O death, where is thy victory? O grave, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting? And it's going to be this spilling of the blood of the Paschal lamb that's going to take place, on Passover. Great connection there, and it just shows us all the more how far we've gotten, and how tragically so, how far we've gotten from our understanding of Judaism, the rituals of Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. I always had to tell students, if you really want to understand the New Testament, you better read the Old Testament first. Nobody starts a book, 2/3 of the way through it and expects to get a sense of character development and all those things. And the people hearing these stories of Jesus have read the whole book, so to speak. They know what they're working with, right? And so they've recently come from this feast of deliverance and Passover, and now they're going to hear about how this new deliverer is going to redeem his people. In fact, that's what the name Yeshua means. He is our salvation. It's an Aramaic version of the name Joshua. You can see the same consonants in there, who is also the salvation of the people as Moses' successor. So great one-to-one parallels here. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a comment. The collision of Greek culture with Hebrew culture is part of our problem with this, in that plot is something that we don't really have before Aristotle, and Aristotle didn't have much effect on the Holy Land.
Mhm.
The notion that plot has a beginning which has nothing antecedent to it, but it causes what follows, and the ending. Aristotle's definition of plot is it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the middle is the result of the beginning, and the end is where nothing results thereafter. That's totally foreign to the writers and the collectors of the scriptures. That's coming out of the Hebrew tradition. If we go to things expecting cause and effect plot the way Aristotle does, which is really what he means by that, is cause and effect is important in plot.
Right.
And Jewish stories aren't told that way.
Right.
But, they have not been affected by the notion that you have to have beginning, middle, and end in that way. And so I think we are the humanities brought into our educational tradition the notion of the Greek plot, not
Right.
the not the more common Jewish custom of contrast,
Right.
and making things apparent by putting them against each other,
Right.
and
Yes.
that makes a lot of difference in how
Yeah.
we read the scriptures.
Parable too. And so what you're saying, Dwight, is, by this time, Aristotle would have had made an impression, through Alexander the Great, Aristotle's student. He would have had some sort of at least secondary influence. But perhaps the reason the Gospels are being written in this narrative style, I'm not saying completely setting aside the Jewish idea, but there is plot in the Gospels. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there is an end. And this is what you're saying is, Aristotle is really messing this whole thing up. The
And
Jews
in
that
the
are,
life, yeah, in the life of Jesus, all right, we get his birth. We don't get anything until he's 30 some years old.
right,
They're not interested in cause and effect. How did he become what he becomes?
yeah.
Uh,
I think what you're
and-
saying is really important, because think about how Jesus taught. Jesus taught in parables, and the idea of contrast. And if what you're saying is true, we don't know what the original text of Matthew really looked like. And what Matthew could have been doing in 85, as this was being put together, would be telling parables, of a sort. But it may have been later that, Gentiles, people influenced by the Gentile philosophical traditions, were putting this into a more narrative type of form. I don't know. It's really interesting, this confluence of cultures.
But even as narrative, it's sort of cut it off and start someplace else. Oh, they got mad at Jesus and he went to the next city.
Yeah,
They don't carry on the plot.
yeah.
They just go off to collect some more of his sayings and put them together. And there's no cause and effect as to when and where and how things are brought about one by the other, until you get sort of the narrative of his crucifixion.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. And this is something I'm gonna have to defer to you on that, because you spent your whole life looking at this type of literary criticism. That's a great insight. That's going to give me something to think about today when I should be working. Any other comments? Well, let's move on to talk about the 10 minutes we have left. To kind of give you an analogy of how this story continued to inform people. You might know about Peter Bruegel painting in the Flemish areas of northern France and the Netherlands. In the 16th century, when that was an area where there was great persecution on behalf of or persecution of Protestants by the Catholic armies. They were trying to rout out Protestants because of this, the scourge of the devil that was taking over the country. And so it was not uncommon for Catholic soldiers to run into a town and just round up people and literally crucify them in a way. They would put them on a wheel. They would tie them to a wheel, and like a big round wagon wheel, and then put them up in the sky. So these crows in the back here that you can kind of see them, basically just leave them to the elements, crucify them, but in a much more a way that involved more suffering. But the real problem would be the crows would come and try to peck out their eyes and all these things, and people would die these horrific deaths. And Bruegel took this story of the slaughter of the innocents and placed it in his own context. I mean, as you can see that these are people clearly in the 16th century, and the Catholic army coming through with their great spears, and it was a scene of terror. But Bruegel didn't try to contextualize it in the first century. He wanted to make clear that people understood the story of, the slaughter of the innocents under Herod, the slaughter of the innocents under Pharaoh. The same thing was happening during the Protestant Reformation, that innocent people were being killed in a way that, history was kind of repeating itself. I've always liked Peter Bruegel, the older and younger, and there were many. What they did is that family painted roughly the same scene over and over and over again. There are many versions of this painting, and what the father couldn't finish, the sons would. But they really gave us insight into communal life in the 16th century at a very, very tumultuous time, and usually drew on biblical themes. And so I've always really enjoyed that. There's so much going on in this painting. Let's move on and talk about Jesus and his baptism. And we have about 10 minutes, and I don't think I do have to leave about 5 minutes early. So I just want to talk about the continuation of the story. We know how the story in Exodus goes. After the Passover, Moses takes the people and into the desert, into the Sinai Peninsula, through the so-called Red Sea. And we know that Cecil B. DeMille made a great, a great event and scene out of this. But Spong makes the point that, let's use our reasoning here. To go through the Red Sea, if you know the map of Egypt, and I should put it up next time, and I'll begin with this. The land of Goshen is north of the Red Sea. And if they were going to make their escape up into the land of Canaan, which is present day Israel, they would have to go south first and then cross the Red Sea. The Red Sea, which is, according to Spong, it seems kind of like it seems like it's too big a number, 200 miles in length, or 200 miles wide, that they would have to, pass through that Red Sea. Again, he's trying to dispel this historicity. It probably never happened that way. The more likely scenario, and there's probably some historical truth to this, is that the Israelites, or those slaves who were able to escape from Egypt at a time when Ramses II was weak as a pharaoh, probably passed through an area, a marshy area between the Mediterranean and the Nile River. We know these kinds of wetland areas that was called the Sea of Reeds. It was the King James Version of the Bible, written in English, that actually interpreted this term as the Red Sea, so that we all, come to think of this great momentous event where the sea splits, and the Israelites walk through, and then as the chariots try to come through, the sea folds in on them. Well, what seems more reasonable is that the Israelites, and we're not talking millions of people, as it says in Exodus, we're not talking hundreds of thousands of people. We're probably talking small bands of groups who escaped over time through this marshy area strategically, because that's where the chariots and the horses of the Egyptians could not go. Their wheels would get bogged down in the mire. So that comes to be interpreted as the miraculous event of God being with God's people. And this is the whole point of the story, that God is with God's people. And it's going to be continually re-emphasized as the story unfolds, as they come to Mount Sinai, as they come into the land of Canaan, as they settle into the land of Canaan. God is still present with God's people, as he was with Moses. the same as with Joshua, the same with Elijah and Elisha. And this is what Spong says that we need to keep in mind. People have just, the people in the synagogues would have just come from the Passover celebration and the retelling of the story of the miraculous escape. And now they're going to hear about Jesus in the light of that story. And that's where we're going to pick up next time. I'm sorry I have to leave a little early for a meeting at 1, but it's probably a good place because I can't get into all of this. But the next time, one thing I do want to mention to you is I've shown you this slide before, but it is a visual of what the ancient Hebrew conception of the universe looked like. This idea of the waters above and the waters below, and then the earth itself was like this disk floating on water with air above, and then the sky, and then the sun. But up above this, there's this dome of heaven called the firmament. And it would be at times when this dome would open up, that water would come down and it would rain. This was most likely still the cosmology that people had in mind in Jesus' day. And it's important to know this because when Jesus is baptized, it's going to be the waters of the heavens that are going to open, not the waters of the Red Sea, but the waters of the heavens. And so this is a point that Spong wants to make, and we'll talk about that next time. So are there any comments before we move on? Things go rather quickly. I'm sorry. So
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you.
yeah, thank you. It's great seeing everybody. Have a wonderful Easter. We'll see you
Thank
next time.
you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.